Thank you very much, Erin. While you were giving that introduction, I was reminded of that famous quote of Lao Tzu, "The journey of 1,000 miles begins with a single step." I mean, it has taken me almost 3.5 years to get to the University of San Diego because I'm constantly reminded on the internet that I was supposed to show up here in December of 2009. But as is usually the case with the people in my position, something went wrong. And essentially, I could not make that trip. So I've constantly been very apologetic to Denise because of that. And Google constantly reminds me also that you were supposed to be here on December some date in 2009. But strangely, I think I'm very happy that ultimately this lecture has matured. And I suppose the timing is also right. And essentially, I think it is a great privilege for me, my wife, and of course my son to be at the University of San Diego. It is one of the most beautiful places in this country, and especially the sunshine is wonderful because, as I was telling Denise and some of her other colleagues, we spent several years in Seattle where it rains constantly, and I think one of the reasons which attracted us back to India was the need for sunshine. Ladies and gentlemen, the subject of today's discussion is something which I think is very important in today's in today's scenario, and that is China and India models of socio-economic globalization. The term globalization essentially dates back, I think if there is a historical context, can take it back to the end of the Cold War in 1989, and then after that the establishment of the WTO, and then after that we started hearing the term global village, that we all live in this wonderful village, and we are all, yes, we live in different countries, but the differences are minor. And that was around 2000, I wrote an article which was considered to be very critical. It was considered to be revisionist because I questioned the whole idea of the global village, because I said that the global village loses sight of the whole issue of culture. And culture is a very important issue which cannot be lost sight of. And the global village somehow became synonymous with the move away from ethnocentrism. I think there was a belief that because we live in a global village and we are interlinked through technology, that the ethnocentrism which is associated with various cultures would disappear. And that was in the backdrop of the desire to have a quote-unquote universal global curriculum which could be a one-size-fits-all, that whether you are in the United States or you are in Europe or you are in Asia, you are studying one curriculum, and that curriculum will give you the perspective which you need to succeed in a global society. Well, I think things change differently. So perhaps that article which was considered revisionist later on became a mainstream thing, because I said that the kind of education which was being imparted was either you want to take a choice between, I use the term which was questioned by my colleagues, Yankee Cola, or you want a knowledge vaccine. And this was brought home to me very tellingly once I was in Pakistan. I was delivering a speech in Islamabad, and a group of students, I think that was the inauguration of a seminar, in which I said that one of the basic challenges we face in management education per se is that we are dependent on textbooks which relate to Western situations which are quote-unquote not related to the scenario on the ground in societies which are different. I think, as usual, I think it was picked up on the net and it said that Vijay Kapur is essentially a person who's chauvinistic. But I was just trying to present a realistic view that culture impacts on how we look at situations and how we view situations. The relationship, ladies and gentlemen, between India and China, there are commonalities, there are also major differences. I mean, yes, India and China essentially are home to more than 33 or 34% of the world's population. They have a rich history, and the historical records are well documented. China was one civilization within one state, and the state was the agent for unification, while India was many kingdoms within one civilization, wherein unity comes from shared religious beliefs. And the Chinese scholar Huan Sang visited the famous ancient Nalanda University in India in the 7th century as per available records. And in India, most architectural monuments were temples managed by priests, while in China, they were palaces and the masters were kings who were managing affairs with citizens. Ancient China has a major history of meritocracy, where candidates for top administrative jobs were selected through imperial examinations and applicants had to be of very high caliber. Unfortunately, within the Indian context, Indian history is mixed because we've had a major period of upheavals, and essentially after 1757, of course, it came under British dominance. Ultimately, for more than 190 years, the British ruled India, and ultimately they left in 1947. So the background of the relationship between India and China, if you want to understand, firstly, you've got to understand the historical context. The historical context is very, very important because both are quote-unquote past-oriented cultures. The past is very, very important. It exists on a day-to-day basis in the minds of most people. If the Boxer Rebellion is important in China and the 1949 revolution is important in China, in India, the Jallianwala Bagh incident of 1919 is very important. The first battle of independence is very important. And more important than that is the contributions of various Indians, whether it is Gandhi or Nehru, and the perspectives they bring on society per se. And I think most of my Western colleagues sometimes think that the past-oriented culture essentially means that people live in the past, they don't live in the future. I think that is totally wrong. They live in the future, in the present, but they constantly have a benchmark related to the past, and their vision of the future is also dictated by how they view the past and what their perceptions are about the present. I mean, it's very difficult for past-oriented cultures to just find middle ground and move on, because moving on is a concept which is essentially a concept in individualist cultures. In collectivist cultures, it is certainly not there. The second issue, which is integral in this kind of a scenario, is the whole issue of religion. Past-oriented cultures essentially have a spiritual context. India as a society gave birth to 4 religions: Hinduism, Jainism, Sikhism, and Buddhism. The oldest was, of course, Buddhism, which came in the 6th century BC, and the newest is Sikhism, which came in the 17th and 18th centuries. And essentially, all these religions gave a spiritual context to India as a society. Even Islam first came to India in the 8th century, and whether it was the Mughals or the others, they stayed on, and they became a part of the Indian milieu. Similarly, in China, the relationship with religion has been very different, and pre-revolution, it was a different kind of a relationship. And in the post-revolution, despite all the other pressures which exist, religion continues to survive within the Chinese scenario. And in 5,000 years, I mean the civilization, the Indian civilization, whether it is the Indus Valley civilization or the other, or the the developments which have taken place, there have been major changes within society, but some things don't change. And it is my desire to highlight those ideas so that gives you some kind of focus as to what exactly are the variables which impact on how we perceive India and China, and what I mean by compassionate socio-economic globalization. Both India and China today are considered to be areas which have great potential for expansion where market forces are concerned. But the approach adopted by both countries is driven by views and by attitudes which are grounded in what the realities are on the ground. I remember once I was in Washington, D.C., and there was a meeting with the Marriott people, and they said, it's so difficult to do business in India. It takes almost 15 years to get an approval done for a land. And Marriott was trying to set up a hotel in Mumbai, which now has come up, but they started in the mid-90s. And it's very easy to do business in China because it's a single window approach and things move very fast. And my answer to him was that, fortunately or unfortunately, India is a democratic society. And democratic societies have their own views, and there's a lot of chaos and confusion in how decisions are taken. So that is why it takes a lot of time. China has its own perceptions. It is a society which is not democratic in the traditional way, but on the other hand, their decision-making structure is very swift. So that is why it takes a lot of time in China, in India, to take a decision. But if I take it a bit further, it brings to another issue right on the surface, which is that the relationship of man with land is very close in Asia. In the Indian subcontinent, especially in India today and Pakistan and the other societies, one's identity is driven by the land you come from. So asking somebody to give up his or her land and essentially is asking somebody to give up their identity. So that is why whenever there are quote-unquote market forces which want to move towards development, they collide against this reality that people don't want to give up their land. We've had many cases within the Indian context when plants had to be moved out. There was a classic case around 2 years ago in West Bengal when Tatas wanted to set up a plant just outside Calcutta. And ultimately they had to move the plant away to Gujarat because Gujarat offered them land without any problems. But in Bengal, the land problem was acute, so they had to move out of there. On the other hand, in Delhi, we see it almost every day. As some of you would be aware of, affordable housing is a major challenge within various parts of India. So there's a desire to develop quote-unquote high-rises and other areas, but for that you need land. And the land which is being provided essentially is being acquired. And it is being acquired, it has to be acquired at market rates, but the market rate is usually never paid. So because of that, people don't want to give up their land. And essentially it leads to massive disputes, and periodically it leads to violence, and the violence sometimes degenerates into conflict because people feel that their entire identity will go. On the other hand, I think the history of land acquisition in China has also been quite traumatic. But the Confucian culture, it imposes, if I may use a term which may be a bit controversial, a degree of discipline on the decision-making process. I remember one of the senior-most IAS officers once told me that he received a visit from one of the mayors in China, and he asked him, what is the problem in India where land acquisition is concerned here? Because in China, we just write a letter to the citizens at large and they comply. I mean, India, no, your letter will never do the trick. I mean, you got to have people to buy into the process. I mean, you got to persuade them that it is in their best interest, and nobody will agree that's in their best interest. And globalization per se, people say that I'm not willing to go in for globalization if my entire identity is going to be submerged. I may get some money, but money will disappear, but my land will be there for my children and my other forebears for generations. So this is something which has to be understood very clearly, that essentially land acquisition becomes a major issue of dispute, and no solution has yet been found by society per se. The government of the day is grappling with a need to come up with a land acquisition law, which is mired in some kind of controversy within Parliament, because on one hand, there is a feeling that until we provide the kind of land which is required for development, we won't move forward. We'll have difficulty in improving our infrastructure. On the other hand, the vote banks which exist are not ready to do that until and unless the whole issue of market compensation is defined. In this backdrop, let me also highlight another issue which some of you may have heard about in the media in the last few months, the whole issue of how the retail matter was dealt with within India. It is an issue which resonates very well within the Indian situation. Right since the mid-90s, this has been going on, that we need foreign direct investment in retail. That would, within the Indian context, that would mean that the Walmarts and the Tescos and the Sainsbury's and the others should be able to set up shop in India. Unfortunately or fortunately, I suppose we have a strong base of what we call traditionally the mom and pop stores. and the mom and pop stores have existed for the last 100 years or not more. And the difficulty is what to do with them, because the fear is that if these mom and pop stores, if Walmart comes or any other big supermarket chain comes, that these mom and pop stores will become infructuous. There is a school of thought which feels that that will not happen, that they will survive. But the fears are quite genuine. And 95% of the retail sector in India is unorganized. It is not an organized sector. So, quote unquote, on one hand, there is a desire to globalize, but the globalization has to be driven by imperatives which protect this particular grouping. The last example, when something like this was done successfully, some of you may be aware that we had the horse carts in India. That was in the mid-70s, called the Tongass. And there was a desire that they should move towards the auto rickshaws. But ultimately, the then government of the day made all the Tonga drivers auto rickshaw drivers. So it was a seamless transition. Unfortunately, in this particular case, you cannot make everybody who has a mom and pop store essentially force a supermarket chain to buy them out and give them all jobs. And that is why this particular interest group is very clear that they will not allow this to happen. Well, the government of the day got a resolution passed in Parliament. But what happened after that is also known, that the opposition parties have said that if they come to power in next year's election, they will again stop this particular process. So in that particular scenario, no supermarket chain is ready to take a risk. They prefer to wait for at least a year to figure out as to what is going to happen. The experience in China was different. I think where retail expansion was concerned, cities were identified, and the process started in 1991. And today, most of the major cities are covered. There are, foreign supermarket chains which exist there, and the process may have been traumatic, but we know little about it. And in India also, they tried to make it less traumatic by saying that only cities over 1 million population will be covered, which are about 53 cities. But the problem is that India is a federal society structure, so the opposition governments are in power in more than half the states. So they said that we will not allow these particular supermarket chains to come into our particular cities. So whether it is Calcutta is ruled by the opposition parties, they will not allow it. Ahmedabad, despite the fact that Gujarat is considered to be a very progressive state, but still the current dispensation decided against it. So in this kind of a scenario, how to integrate the people at large within the policy construct has become more and more challenging. And whenever I talk about culture, I think the feeling is that the collectivist culture is a culture which resists change. No, it is not. It does not resist change. It just has various stakeholders who impact upon the decision-making process and say that as far as we are concerned, we should also be heard and give us a way so that we can contribute. And I think the difference lies because the collectivist cultures, I think is the I versus we syndrome. The individualist culture, the individual is the most important. The collectivist culture, the group is the most important. And if the group is important, the group wants to have a role to play in how the entire society perceives it and how decisions are taken. So I have given you two basic examples as to how the dissonance rises. Land acquisition has impacted on our ability to improve our infrastructure, because we have these massive road projects which are supposed to link various parts of the country, and they were initially modeled on the Eisenhower's model of the interstate projects. But the progress over the last 15 years has been very mixed. The only major success story is, of course, the expressway which has been constructed between Delhi and Agra. But even that expressway took almost several years to get through the problems of land acquisition. Now, are there any commonalities? And I think there's a famous quote of Mao Zedong, and he said, "I have witnessed the tremendous energy of the masses. On this foundation, it is possible to accomplish any task whatsoever." One great advantage within the Indian context and the Chinese context is, of course, the availability of human capital. and that human capital can drive any process of development or globalization. But that human capital has to be channelized. And this is where it becomes a challenge, because we have gigantic problems in two major areas. I mean, there is a school of thought which says that India is the biggest education market in the world, because education is considered to be integral to self-growth. But there is another school of thought. The realistic school of thought is that in the 1823 group, we have a greater, the number of dropouts is very high. So what we call the gross enrollment ratio is a challenge, whether in China or in India, how to retain people and keep them in the universities and the institutions of higher learning so that their skill base is enhanced. And the constant complaints keep on coming that we are educating a cadre of people who are unemployable, because the businesses claim that most of them cannot be hired in jobs because their skill base is very narrow. So I think 2 years ago, the current dispensation, the government decided that we need to increase the skill base of approximately 50 million people by 2020. And because we got to give them the skills so that they become functional players within the economic climate. And by functional, I mean that essentially there is a top layer which is very well qualified, and there is a bottom layer which has problems. But the middle layer is the one we have tremendous difficulties in. So enhancing the skill base is something which I call the socio-economic challenges, that we have to enhance the skill base, and while enhancing the skill base, we have to ensure that all these individuals have the skills which makes them contributory players in trying to build up the quote-unquote a socio-economic base which is workable. And here we run into another problem, and this is a problem which some of you may be aware of. This is the whole difficulty about the urban-rural divide. And I think people normally forget that both China and India are agro-based countries. Agriculture is an important field of endeavor. Within the Indian context, our 72% of our population still resides in the villages. Only 28% resides in the towns. And because most of them are dependent on agriculture, they still reside there, they hold on to their land, but because the contribution of agriculture to the GDP has declined. Currently, it's around 23 to 24%. And I think the kind of jobs they get make it incumbent on them to travel to the towns in order to seek out occupations which are low skill or which are under skill occupations. But later on, they retreat to the villages. Now, how are we going to bridge the gap between the urban-rural divide becomes a major constraint, because yes, we want to set up agro-based industries, but the agro-based industries have to be those which generate adequate income. And more important, that is our contribution from agriculture has to increase. And sometimes, there are these assumptions which are developed, and some discussion takes place. We should learn from the American model. After the Great Depression, the family farm just disappeared, and everyone just became a part of the industrial milieu. But that required an investment over several years to make it happen. And it has been tried in some places that you persuade people to give up their land in the hope that there's a better quality of life elsewhere. But we have found that that doesn't work in practice, because what the people want is they want to hold on to their land, but yet they want a job outside. And when push comes to shove, they always retreat back to the way they have been accustomed to. And I think a similar problem is coming to the fore in China, that people are being, the urban-rural divide is coming to the surface, because there are certain sections of Chinese society which are very well developed, which are the special economic zones. The other areas may not be so well developed. So the gap between the haves and the have-nots, if I may use that economic term, keeps on increasing. And our challenge is how to make the haves essentially, how to bring some equity in the process. And that equity is not coming, because on one hand, we see that there is tremendous growth. On the other hand, we see that the number of poor people is not decreasing. The number of poor people is increasing per se. So in this kind of a situation, what kind of, what should a society do? I mean, there is one school of thought which says that the problem is because India has moved away from manufacturing into the services sector. And because it has moved into the services sector, ultimately it has, it requires high-skilled people or not high-skilled people, semi-skilled people, which the society does not have. If again we had a manufacturing base, certainly it will give more jobs to people who are technically qualified. But as all of you know, that the manufacturing base within the Indian scenario is hardly 23 to 24% contribution to GDP, and the services sector is more than 50%. On the Chinese side, the manufacturing contribution to GDP is much higher, but on the Indian side, it is not. So that particular policy construct has also not been very successful. And what has happened is that, we have the 5-year plan system within the Indian context. Currently, we finished the 12th 5-year plan in 2012, and it was supposed to be the education plan, where the bulk of the investment went to education. It was felt that education is very important, and education right from the primary to the, quote, higher education level. And the government of the day, in its wisdom, decided that we need a Right to Education Act, that up to the age of 14, education should be free. That essentially empowered lots of people, that children were sent to school. But again, we collided with the reality that the schools were devoid of buildings. And we had to, if the building is not there, and the fact that the teacher is not there, what is the point in a school? And I think currently we are grappling with this major challenge, that how do we decide what kind of school system we have so that the children who go to school have an infrastructure. And if they are not going to have an infrastructure, the policy mechanism will become infructuous. And I think I am giving you these hard realities because what you see is a sanitized picture of a great market. But that sanitized picture of a great market has some intrinsic flaws which are driven by imperatives which the market is not able to figure out. Now, if this was a non-collectivist culture, I mean, the answer would be, let the market decide what is to be done. But it does not happen in the Indian scenario. Perhaps the only example recently has been one of our airlines, Kingfisher, is a private airline which went into trouble, and ultimately there was a lot of pressure on the government to do a bailout for them, but the government, the central government, refused to do a bailout. But they did do a bailout for Air India. I mean, Air India is a national airline. It's considered to be an airline which loses a lot of money, but still continues to fly because it's considered to be, quote unquote, India's flag carrier. So whether it loses money or does not make money is irrelevant. It just has to be there because it's a question of identity. And I think this is something, whenever you talk about globalization, the perception is always if the market does not want it, like Eastern Airlines stopped flying, Pan Am stopped flying, suddenly the other airlines should stop flying. Perhaps what is happening to Kingfisher is a step in that particular direction, but that is also a step that even the jury is out whether it's going to happen or not going to happen. So what is, this entire business of compassionate socio-economic globalization? I think my view of the compassion is that we have to include almost everybody within its ambit. And essentially, we cannot let anybody drop through the cracks. Because within the Indian context, we have some other constraints. We have internal insurgencies. And those internal insurgencies are largely driven by economic imperatives. And those economic imperatives are also driven largely by the relationship between man and land. And I think some of you may be aware of the term Naxalite insurgencies. That is affecting many portions of India, that is considered to be what we call the Naxalite corridor, which goes down from Nepal and goes right up to Myanmar. Now, how do we deal with that? The question is that the only best way to deal with that is give them a quality of life so that they feel that there is hope. And essentially, this is where the challenge is coming, that what kind of economic imperative should be provided. I remember, there was an illusion about my service in the IAS, and I had spent several years in the state of Bihar. And the state of Bihar is considered to be one of the poorest states in the country. And despite being one, I suppose, it is a very important tourist state because Buddha achieved nirvana in Bodh Gaya. It is an important tourist destination. But it is a state which has seen tremendous amount of corruption per se, and the political structure was responsible for that. And there was a part of the state which was affected by the similar kind of insurgency, if I may use a term, more than 2 decades ago. And I think when I was sent there, I found that the needs of the people were basic. I think they wanted drinking water. And the government of the day was unable to provide them drinking water. They had to walk 5 kilometers to get potable water. So we started an accelerated program in which we said that we had to drill what we call hand pumps. I think some of you may have seen them, the hand pumps. And so nobody had to walk more than 500 yards to get drinking water. After that program was successfully implemented, I think that insurgency just disappeared because nobody had a rationale for some disaffection any longer. And it is strange that even now, 20 years later, I think there are lots of people who come and meet me in Delhi and say, why can't you come back and do other things? So that may be an irrelevant kind of an issue, but it brings to fore another challenge which exists within our structure, which is the whole governance issue. The governance issue is very, very important whenever you want to implement a framework which integrates socio-economic globalization. You have to have a structure which understands what the people want. And sometimes the governments of the day, whether in the state or in the federal setting, are unable to do that because most of them, exist on a day-to-day basis. We have a major challenge these days in India since 1996 that most of the federal governments are coalitions. So coalition politics has its own negatives because it imposes obligations which are not driven by any kind of imperatives except survival. Because the most important thing the government wants is to survive. So they make these policy compromises, and some of those policy compromises succeed and some of them don't. But in the quest to remain in power, that's what they do. And I think this has become a major challenge that we are facing a problem today that governance, we feel, there is a perception within the Indian situation that governance is more or less moving at a very fitful pace. And on the other hand, globalization has led to the creation of what we call a strong middle class. In that, we are very lucky. Within India, there is a strong middle class, and that particular middle class has aspirations. China also a strong middle class has come, which may be allied to the party cadres and others, but yes, there's a strong middle class. But that strong middle class has desires, and those desires are not being met. And because of that, since those desires are not being met, the governance deficit continues to grow. And in this particular background, I think another reality has to be postulated is that one positive thing which has happened is that the entrepreneurial tendencies of Indian businessmen have been solidified because the government has empowered them. It has not stood in the way. It may not be the ideal situation because people still complain that there is a lot of regulation, but still setting up a business within India is not very difficult. On the other hand, setting up a business within the Chinese situation may be a bit challenging, but in India it is not. And I think because of that, we have created a cadre of entrepreneurs, but that cadre of entrepreneurs essentially has not succeeded per se in developing a framework which includes everybody within their ambit. The Tatas are one company which essentially has implemented what we call the whole idea of globalization in an inclusive manner. The Tatas, which is one of our largest industrial houses, essentially, when they took up, when they bought out Jaguar in Liverpool, there was a perception that they will lay off almost everybody. But they have laid off nobody. And essentially, even in all the companies they have within India, they have ensured that each and every job is protected. And I think this is one of the basic challenges which has to be understood, that if globalization has to succeed within the Indian context, job loss is not a workable assumption. We had a tragedy a few months ago in Maruti, which is one of our flagship companies, that essentially there were some fears of job loss. And the workers went on strike, and essentially the strike became violent, and several people were killed, and part of the company was burnt down. Now, that is the problem, that when people have feelings that they will lose everything, then you cannot stop them. And I think within our own situation, this is becoming more and more apparent that on one hand, people want an enhanced quality of life. On the other hand, while wanting an enhanced quality of life, they don't want to give up the traditions which give them the identity. Now, in this backdrop, there's a presentation which I've given to Erin, and she'll be circulating it, but I thought that I will take something out of it and basically bring these points up for discussion. There is this entire issue of human rights also, which impacts on how we think about globalization. And more important than that the rights of the few should also be protected. And I think there is this famous quote by Amartya Sen, when his views on poverty are pretty well known. And this is the quote in which he said, "The notion of human rights builds on our shared humanity. These rights are not derived from the citizenship of any country or the membership of any nation, but are presumed to be claims or entitlements of every human being. They differ, therefore, from constitutionally created rights guaranteed for specific people." Our problem is exactly this type. On one hand, we have to protect human rights. On the other hand, there are some situations where those human rights have to be impinged upon. And I think this is a situation, as I mentioned, about the Naxalite corridors and other places. Those are areas where there is rampant disaffection, and how to control it, sometimes harsh measures have to be taken. And taking those harsh measures requires steps which sometimes leads us into tremendous problem. So, I think the difficulty which I am trying to say is that both societies, whether it is India or whether it is China, are collectivist cultures where the number of stakeholders is very high. And because the number of stakeholders is very high, the kind of decisions which you can take are limited and hamstrung by realities over which you have little control. And until and unless you are able to get control on those realities, the kind of decisions which governments take are incremental. And those incremental decisions are usually driven by imperatives that, like political imperatives, like one of the basic problems, another act which is moving within the Indian scenario is the Food Security Act. That there's a desire that every person should be provided a certain amount of food. Now, giving somebody a certain amount of food is a good idea, but essentially who's that person who lives below the poverty line, identifying that person is becoming a major challenge. And another difficulty, whether in India or in China, is the whole problem of corruption. In India, there is a very good program which was taken up from, I think, one of the programs which came up during the Depression. We call it the National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. I'll finish in 5 minutes. The National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme. Now, this National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme was considered to be one of those compassionate schemes for socio-economic empowerment. Unfortunately, the amount of leakage in those schemes, if I may use an Indian term, is that barely 15% of the funds allocated is reaching the ultimate beneficiaries. 85% just disappears somewhere. And I think we have been trying long and hard to find a way out, including using the NGOs, including using other avenues, but it has not succeeded. And this scheme guarantees employment to every beneficiary for at least 100 days in a year. So this is supposed to be a scheme which empowers them, at least improves their quality of life. But to some extent, it is a successful scheme, but to a large extent, this particular variable impacts on that. So to conclude, I think the idea of the global village, as when I started off this particular presentation, the global village as an idea has, within the Indian and Chinese construct, it is not a one-size-fits-all kind of a situation. The cultural imperatives drive each and every behavior pattern in a manner in which you have got to make adjustments. And those adjustments sometimes collide with market realities. And then you've got to adjust them according to the needs of the day. And if you are unable to adjust them to the needs of the day, there are delays. I remember that the current commerce minister last year, he was in Davos and he was under tremendous attack because suddenly they had put a full stop on the retail issue. And he used a term in Davos, he said it's just a pause. And that entire statement came to haunt him because it became an indefinite pause. And then later on, when they decided to move away from the pause to action, and then what happened is 18 members of the ruling coalition walked out, with the result that the government became unsure whether it will survive. So in order to survive, it had to make compromises with some other parties, and those parties further hamstrung their maneuverability. So I mean, in conclusion, I think it is a mixed bag what you have there. On one hand, there is a desire that we should be a society which certainly moves forward and at least has some kind of impact on the world at large, except being a market where everybody dumps goods. And we don't want to be the quote-unquote supplier of trained manpower to the world at large. And it is a great challenge for India. Not so much of a challenge now because I think there's a recession in different parts of the country to attract our young people back. But I think the young people have also expectations. And I will end by this quote by Georges Clemenceau, the famous former Prime Minister of France. And this is indicative of the problem we face where action is concerned. When a man asks himself what is meant by action, he proves he is not a man of action. This is our problem. People ask us what to do, and the government is asked what to do, and essentially they only ask that when they don't want to do anything. Action is a lack of balance. In order to act, you must be somewhat insane. A reasonably sensible man is satisfied with thinking. I think this is a famous quote by Swami Vivekananda, who is one of our great scholars, and his speech at the World Council of Religions in 1893 is talked about. And he made this famous statement that what is the difference between Indians and Americans? And he said that, the Indians should act more and think less. Americans should think more and act less. So perhaps the kind of globalization we need is both of them find some middle ground in both action and thinking, because otherwise we will be debating this particular aspect even 15 years down the road. Thank you very much for your patience, ladies and gentlemen.